There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another encounter with some groovy moments from the past. We're visiting the 60s with host Dick Scapatoni, whose pop group Harper's Bazaar had a hit record back then called Feelin' Groovy. He'll be talking with our guests about a decade that shaped a whole generation, not only with the most magnificent music ever made, but also the politics, protests, and pretty much everything that happened in the swingin' 60s. So Dick, who's on today's show?
Thanks, John. Recently, TV legend and film star Dick Van Dyke became the first ever recipient of the Red Skelton America's Clown Award. We're going to hear about that and more from our first guest today, Ann Pratt, the executive director of the Red Skelton Museum of American Comedy. This annual award is voted on by fans of Red Skelton nationwide. The museum, which I didn't even know existed, features a 3,500 square foot interactive exhibit entitled Red Skelton, A Legacy of Laughter. And we'll take a walk through that museum today. Next up, we'll meet Tony Butala, and you'll know who he is when I rattle off a few of their hits. The Way You Look Tonight, Hurts So Bad, Going Out of My Head, Can't Take My Eyes Off of You. Tony's the only original member left of the Lettermen. That's coming up. Stick around.
I think I'm going out of my head. Yes, I think I'm going out of my head. Over you, over you. I want you to want me. I need you so badly. I can't think of anything but you. Just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you. You'd be like heaven to touch.
Recently, TV legend and film star Dick Van Dyke became the first ever recipient of the Red Skelton America's Clown Award. We're going to hear about that and more from today's guest, Ann Pratt, the executive director of the Red Skelton Museum of American Comedy. The award itself is a statue of Red as Freddie the Freeloader, with his arm outstretched and his hat over his heart as if to say, "Good night and may God bless," which was Red's trademark goodbye at the end of every show he did on TV and in concert. This annual award is voted on by fans of Red Skelton nationwide. The museum features a 3,500 square foot interactive exhibit entitled Red Skelton, A Legacy of Laughter. Let's find out more about what's going on at this showplace that I didn't know even existed. Ann Pratt, welcome to America's Oldies But Goodies.
Thank you. So excited to be with you all.
Well, it seems like you've got a lot of stuff coming up there, a lot of activity going on. And I was unaware that any of that was happening until I heard about it. Then I said, we got to know more about it.
And then you knew, right?
Yeah, right. We got to know more about Red Skelton because I, like millions of others, watched him. I can't remember if it was always the same night once a week.
I think it was Tuesday night, 7:30. I mean, I think the very first season he was on a different night, but for the next 20 years he was Tuesday night.
Always Tuesday, and I have to tell you, and it just occurs to me, I didn't even make notes on this. My group, Harper's Bazaar, we did the Red Skelton show. we did not meet Red. When we were taping our portion, he wasn't there, so I never got to meet him. But I do have to say my brother, who is an artist and been a painter for many years, met Red at several of the galleries that represented my brother Jim and Red Skelton. So somehow Red's in our family at least a little bit. Let's go back, even before we start talking about what's going on right now. Can you backtrack before he became successful? We don't have to talk about him as a little boy, but let's maybe, I don't know, get into it in high school.
I'll give you a little bit of little boy, because what's so cool, where Red Skelton was born is located right across the street from the museum.
Really?
So his birthplace is right across the street. It's still standing there in its original location. And actually, since Red's been gone 20 years, they're dedicating an Indiana historical marker in front of his birthplace this year during our festival. So it's super exciting, and that's just, it's really neat. The house is not open. It's just owned by the university, which is where the museum is. But it's really great that it's just so close, and it's like his legacy has kind of come home to his beginnings. And Red was born there, and he was the youngest of 4 kids, and his father died before he was born. And they were just so poor that Red did anything he could, to make ends meet. With the family, he'd contribute money, breaking down boxes at the local J.C. Penney, or stacking pins at the bowling alley, or selling newspapers in front of the Pantheon Theater. And, he jokes that, well, when did you leave? And he said, well, I was hungry. I needed to eat, so he left home when he was about 14 and went on the road with a traveling medicine show. And as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah.
He picked up with vaudeville and moved on from there.
I'm looking at the website, redskeltonmuseum.org. That's what it's on my screen, yeah.
Right, and we've got some lot of neat things about the history of the museum, as well as little things about Red, kind of like highlights of Red in Vincennes, like places where he used to work, places where he performed, that if you do come, you can kind of see the whole picture of Red growing up.
Looks like a lot of great shots in there, and it looks like is Vincennes a small town?
Really small, 18,000 people. And it's not much bigger probably than it was when Red was here. We're kind of in the middle of cornfields, but we like to say we're on the way to anywhere, because we're like 2 hours from Indianapolis and 2 hours from Louisville and just 3 hours from Nashville, 4 hours from Chicago. So it's kind of like we're right in the middle of the Midwest, and you can get here really easily, which is kind of nice.
Well, the shots on the website are neat to look at because, like the main shots of Main Street, they're just normal Main Street, but they're Main Street from many years ago, not Main Street today.
Right, because this town, believe it or not, was the oldest town in Indiana. And so many of our Main Street buildings were from the early 1800s to middle 1800s, and they're still standing, and it's awesome.
Did you ever know Red?
I did not know Red. It just so happened whenever Red was in Vincennes, I was not. I was at college, or I was somewhere when he would make different trips back, and I never did get to meet him. But, of course, I grew up knowing all about him and everything, because him being from this town, really a famous, Indiana, Vincennes' famous son. So that's pretty neat.
What turned you on to becoming the executive director of the museum?
Well, I got involved with the museum about 2 years before it opened. They had kind of a planning board. It had become a 501c3, and they'd elected a board of directors, and I was invited to be on the board because I just was involved in town and an educator, and they wanted help with the, connecting the education part of the museum. And then when it moved on to they decided they really needed a full-time staff person to help with fundraising and to help with getting it going. They hired me. I was their first hire, and I didn't start as the executive director. I started in marketing, and so that's where I started. And then about 2 years ago, I moved into the executive director position, and I've been there ever since. But so it was really nice being in on the ground floor, helping to raise the money, get some of the grants that we needed to help us open. And I feel like I really got immersed in the whole museum process. You
mentioned marketing. So when you first started in marketing, were you marketing beyond the boundaries of the state? Were you marketing to the whole U.S.?
No, we weren't. That's what's interesting. We were able to raise the money basically locally. The $6 million to, fund the museum was really raised between a couple of big grants and then local money. So this is really our first stretch out into national media, with shows like yours, because just being from a small town, we're really we were unsure how to get the word out to everybody about the Red Skelton Museum. You know, we have a Facebook page and we have our website, but, you know, I just feel fortunate now as it's starting to catch on, we're getting more opportunities to talk to people and let other people know about this Midwest gem that we have here in Vincennes.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the highlights of Red's career that are featured in the museum. Can you just sort of maybe go room to room? And
Little tour, okay. You kind of start out with, and on our website there's actually a little thing called Take a Tour that kind of gives you a little feel for some parts of the museum. It doesn't get all of them, but it gets a few parts. But when guests come in, we usually start out with a short film, about 10 minutes, and it's very well done film. I tear up every single time I watch it, and I've seen it a million times. It is so well done and just really talks about Red's show business career and his humble beginnings in this small town and just what an impact he made on comedy and, you know, his brand of comedy. And then you come out to a timeline, and the museum is very interactive, and many of the TVs are motion activated, and they show clips from Red's TV shows and movies. Interactive places, you know, to do Red's Stagger Walk like he did with his physical comedy. And it goes chronologically with vaudeville and his physical comedy that he did on stage. And then he became, of course, a radio star in the 1940s. And you can put sound effects into Red's radio show and look at some of the original sound effects that he used, you know, on the radio shows. And then his feature film career, which he made like over 40 feature films. And so it talks a little bit about those. And then on into his Emmys that he won for television and for comedy writing, his time in the armed services, and a little bit about his personal life with his hardship with his son Richard dying of leukemia at the age of 10, and just how he persevered through the hardships. And then, you know, our biggest gallery is dedicated to his characters and his TV career. And each character has its own vignette with his original costumes and TVs that play skits with just that character, like just Freddie the Freeloader or just Clem Cadillhopper. And that's a nice big room with that. And we have an interactive clown makeup display where visitors can sit down and actually use virtual makeup to do their own clown face there in that area.
yeah.
So we have an exhibit for his Pledge of Allegiance, which was so iconic, and then kind of a creative gallery because Red was an artist, a big painter, and he also wrote songs. A lot of people didn't realize he was a composer, and he also was an author. He wrote several books. So the last part of the gallery is really dedicated to his creative side.
You know, you mentioned comedy writer. I never thought of Red as a comedy writer other than maybe writing some of his own stuff. But did he do a stint as a comedy writer?
No. You may have misunderstood. He was a composer. He wrote songs. And then he wrote books, but his books are actually very serious.
Huh?
You know, very introspective, you know, maybe somewhat autobiographical, some of them, about just some of the hardships he had growing up and things.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if any of the songs he wrote, if they were ever placed with anybody that recorded them.
Some of them have been recorded. We have pictures of him, like, conducting a band, playing some of his songs.
Okay.
His were almost exclusively marches.
Oh.
And so I think it'd be great sometime to get some high school band competition to do Red Skelton marches, you know. But yeah, no, he was a very talented man. I swear he must have never slept.
Probably a little updated John Philip Sousa. So
Right, exactly.
And when his writing, he was writing instrumental songs, not songs with lyrics.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
gotcha. Okay.
No lyrics. A few of his songs, we have a piano book, and a few of the songs, because he also wrote poetry, and he has like two of those, I don't know if you remember the Gravette Giants, those huge coloring books from the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
He did illustrations for two of those, and one's called Frog Follies, and one's called Clown Alley.
Oh.
And each page with a picture has a little poem that he did. So some of those poems kind of turned into song lyrics in some of his marches.
On the website, we're talking about Red liked to be introduced as one of America's clowns. Can you talk about this year's recipient of the first ever Red Skelton America's Clown Award, Dick Van Dyke?
Sure. Well, we kind of put it out there to the public. You know, we're going to start this Red Skelton One of America's Clowns Awards because Red Skelton, really, that is, like you said, how he liked to be introduced. And he had the type of humor that really used his whole body. You know, they say a comedian says funny things, a clown says things funny. You know, so his whole body comes into how he portrays his story and his joke. And we were just looking to have nominations for someone who personified that type of humor. And Dick Van Dyke got the most votes his first year. He was probably got 25% of all the votes we received. And so he was the clear winner, and I just think an excellent choice for this inaugural award.
And as you're talking about the body movements also, in addition to whatever a person is saying, Dick Van Dyke was all over the place, falling down constantly.
Absolutely. And Red Skelton had the same thing. He really tore his body up with all his falls and silliness, to make the story funny. So it's, I think he was a great choice. And, obviously he can't be here this summer. He's such a busy man, but we're just pleased to be able to name him the first winner.
That's neat. Number one, the first person up. You started to get into, as you were going through some of the rooms, Red's TV show. Can you go any further in depth with some of the things that Red did on TV? I know I watched the show for I don't know how many years. How many years did you say he was on? 20?
He was on 20 years, 1951 to 1971.
Okay. Talk about some of the characters that he was playing in those years.
Well, probably the most beloved character just based on Red. It was Red's favorite character. And then all of our guests, it's most of their favorite characters is Freddie the Freeloader, the lovable bum, and he just down on his luck, but would just do anything for anybody. And, his iconic red and white striped scarf, which is kind of funny. He was always swirling that scarf around on the TV show. Well, the actual scarf has little weights in the bottom. Oh. So it would swirl nicely when he would flip it around his neck. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And apparently he had the whole Freddy costume in like one of those old blue Samsonite type suitcases. You remember the hard side that I'm talking about?
I probably had one,
Well, he told his wife, if the house gets on fire, grab the Freddy suitcase. He did not. That was like a prized possession, that costume and that suitcase. And we have it on display here, with the Freddy costume.
Okay, I'm hearing a song trying to squeeze in here. Let's shift gears, take a quick break, and listen to the music.
Riding on the city of New Orleans, Illinois Central, Monday morning rail. 15 cars and 15 restless riders, 3 conductors, 25 sacks of mail. All along the southbound Odyssey, the train pulls out at Kankakee and rolls along past houses, farms, and fields, passing trains that have no name, freight yards full of old black men.
The Letterman name first appeared in February 1958 on the marquee of the Desert Inn Hotel in Las Vegas, where our guest today, Tony Butala, and his group starred in a review of the 1920s and 30s. Tony played the part of Bing Crosby in that review, and I'm going to ask him about some of the other Hollywood heavyweights he worked with in the late 50s. By the early 60s, the Lettermen were starting to crank out the big hits on their own. First, there was The Way You Look Tonight, and from there it just got better. When I Fall in Love, Theme from a Summer Place, Going Out of My Head, Can't Take My Eyes Off of You, and then in 1969, Hurt So Bad. They made some 200 appearances on television shows like Dick Clark's American Bandstand, Shindig, and Hullabaloo. They've never stopped recording and performing, although Tony is the only original member left. They're booked right straight through this summer and into the fall. I got to ask Tony about how he's going to handle the road these days. So, Tony Butala, welcome to America's Oldies But Goodies.
Well, gee whiz, Dick, it's wonderful to be with you on this fantastic show.
I'm trying to remember. You might remember, although it's unlikely because you've done thousands of shows, but I think Harper's Bazaar worked with you, and I'm going to guess it. Maybe it was a television show or two. I remember working with you guys. I just don't remember where it was.
Yeah, Dick, I don't remember either, but I think it was a television show, not a live performance.
One of the guys that we worked with a lot, and I noticed you mention it in your notes, Mike Douglas.
Oh, sure.
It was probably one of the nicest TV people I think I ever met.
Oh, wasn't he great? He was such a gentleman. And the thing I noticed about Mike Douglas, after being interviewed by Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin and so many other people. When we did an interview with Mike Douglas, he didn't have a cue card guys behind us with the questions that he would research and write out.
Yeah.
He had such a snap mind. He never had cue cards. He would study our biography a day or two before. When we got into the interview, he was flat on.
That kind of guy, I'm going to say that anytime we were near Philadelphia, we would do the Douglas show, and I do remember one show that I was not at. It happened to be I had gotten drafted into the Army, and I was gone for a 4-month stint right in the middle when Feelin' Groovy came out. So Harper's did the show, and Douglas blew up a big picture of my face, larger than life, and he sang along on stage with my face on his face. So
that's funny. That sounds like something that Mike would do.
Yeah. He seemed to have the leeway to do that, and took every chance to just be relaxed and just a good guy. Kind of a rarity, I think, in the business. What we should do before we really get off and running is let's go back before the successful time in showbiz for you. Let's start. We don't need to start at the beginning, but start before the Lettermen. What was going on in the early days for you?
Well, I was a member of the Mitchell Boys Choir from 1950, late 1950, for 4 years. I was like an 11-year-old kid when I got in the choir. In the Mitchell Boys Choir, a lot of people may not know the name, but the Mitchell Boys Choir have been over 200 motion pictures and television shows from the 30s through the 2000s. And some of the classic motion pictures they were in were Going My Way with Bing Crosby, The Bishop's Wife with David Niven, Angels with Dirty Faces with, I can't do it unless I'm pulling an imaginary belt up to my hips. What's that? You dirty rat?
Cagney. Jimmy Cagney, yeah.
He started that movie, Angels with Dirty Face. So anyway, the Mitchell Boys Choir were on countless local TV shows, international TV shows, and a lot of famous alumni have come from the Mitchell Boys Choir. Like Joe Tapparella was his name, but he changed his name to Steve Rossi.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and several other people, the Sandpipers, all three of the Sandpipers were members of the Mitchell Boys Choir at the same time, and I was their choir director, assistant choir director, whenever Bob Mitchell was around. They were 3 or 4 years younger. So Bob Mitchell has cranked out a lot of people. Bill Tracy of the Modernaires and Gurney Bell of the Sportsmen's Quartet. They all came from the Mitchell Boys Choir.
Do you remember being on the set of any of the movies that the choir was in? And if so, what are your memories about all the camera setup, the lights, the blocking? And I mean, how old were you when you started with them?
11 years old.
Okay, so that's got to be big time memories with you.
Well, yeah, and one of the biggest memories after being in the choir a while was all the TV directors and producers and writers and cameramen just complimenting Bob Mitchell and the boys, because we were a machine. We were a factory. We didn't mess around. We were 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. But Bob Mitchell has such discipline and had been in the business so long, he taught us that when you go, your 10, 12 boys going to MGM, or a beautiful motion picture studio, that they don't need time for you to be kids. They need time for you to be professional singers. Bob Mitchell had us learn, had all the notes. We stand like little soldiers in 2 lines of 5, or the little riser there, and waited on the set under the lights until they told us what to do. And so often there was a group called the Megalyn Kiddies. They were little actor kids and a little agent Megalyn had. And when they were on the set, they couldn't find these kids. They're running up the ladders and swinging from the curtains. But Bob Mitchell, all those years, had a professional boys choir. We didn't cost. See, time is money. We came in there with our parts learned, and we sat straight. So it saved the producers and directors much, much money. And that's why for 45 years, Bob Mitchell was a very respected man in the choir industry in Hollywood. And
as you're talking about that, I just have visions. I'm kind of imagining what it was like at that age. You were surrounded, really encapsulated, I guess you'd say, in showbiz, from an early age.
Well, that's one way to put it. I feel more embalmed in show business now. But no, it's been my whole life, yeah.
Now, I'm 71. I'll ask you, are you older than me or younger?
I'm older than you.
Okay, all right. So we're both up in that stratosphere.
Oh, sure. I'm about 5 years older than you at least.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, let's talk about a little bit more about some of the famous people that you've been around. I just automatically know there's hundreds of them, but there's so many stories involved. What are some of the most notable people that you remember? This would be, we can get into the 60s, too, when the Lettermen started getting all of the hit records. Who stands out as some of the notable famous people that you were around?
Well, one that stands out was a little before the Lettermen, when I was in the Choir Boys, was Walt Disney.
Oh, jeez.
However,
yes.
Years and years later, when the Lettermen going in the 60s, we worked for Walt, and he remembered me from my time as 11 and 12-year-old kid in the Mitchell Choir Boys.
Wow, isn't that something?
What a gentleman. He took us around, and he treated us fine, the best hotels. When he came across the country to do one of his shows, it was all first-class hotels and planes. He just was a real-class gentleman and knew how to treat entertainers.
I've sort of idolized Walt for many years, and it's time for me to get back down to Disneyland. I got to get my hit. But I know, looking back on that whole era, there is a museum in San Francisco that his daughter started. I don't know if you've been to it, and I can't remember.
No, I can't. I'm very interested, though.
Oh, it is a knockout. It's not purposely for kids. It's for all of us adults, and it's Walt Disney almost from day one, 2 or 3 floors of everything from statuettes from around the world. The guy just received, stuff from people all over the world. Anyway, next time you go to the city, take time to check it out. And it may simply be called the Walt Disney Museum. Obviously, his name is in it, but I can't remember the full name of it.
You just gave me enough information to realize that about a year ago, last summer, we went to that building, and we did an interview from that building with one of the guys there, and it just broke my heart. We couldn't stay around and really go through it.
Yeah.
We just had a very fast tour.
Yeah.
It's magnificent.
An absolute knockout of a museum. She did just a great job with it. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned Disney. I really think of him as being one of the real giants. Who else do you think of that you were impressed with?
Oh, Jack Benny was so nice, and George Burns. But those guys, what I found, when you go up to someone now for an autograph, that maybe a nouveau riche, kind of a new star in television and radio over the last 5-10 years, so often, I don't want to generalize, but so often they seem not to have time for the common man.
Yeah.
The thing I noticed about Jack Benny and George Burns, they were both from vaudeville, and they would the train and the snow and the ice and the rain and the sleet and the misconnections. These people really earned their show business letters. And I think because of that, they're extra kind and extra understanding to anyone that they worked with. I mean, the Princess of Men, they were asked about our families. We go to the commissary together. We'd sit and have conversations about sports, or they'd ask us questions. So those, by all means, Jack Benny and George Burns are the two top nicest celebrities that we've ever worked with.
That is wonderful. And again, as you mentioned, what their whole life was in showbiz, they were as easily as steeped, if not more steeped, than you have been. So you had a real sense of connection with them. We did, as Harper's, do you remember in the 60s, and I don't know if it's ever survived since then, TV show called The Kraft Music Hall?
Oh, of course, sure.
And I can't remember the two guys that produced it, but they were knockout producers. And it was.
Did you do that show?
We did that show 2 times. One was with George Burns as the guest host.
Oh, my goodness.
And
wow.
He was on the set before everyone else and stayed on the set until after everyone else left.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was a worker.
Dedicated to his trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me shift gears just for a second here, because I'm just curious. Just even talking about our age, we all remember back in the day when we were as fit as a fiddle, supposedly anyway. Now, as older baby boomers, we probably no longer look much like Jack LaLanne. How's your health nowadays?
Well, Dick, I've been very fortunate. I've just been healthy as a horse most of my life. About 5 years ago, I had a lower lumbar surgery, but I had a great doctor in Beverly Hills, and Cedars-Sinai Hospital, and the scar was about maybe an inch in the middle of my back, and that's it, and been no repercussions since. I'm as good as gold, as good as I was when I was 25 years old.
Boy, that's spectacular. And I went on your website, just looking at the rest of the year for being on tour. I'm not exactly sure how you do it. I couldn't not do it now. But you're working all through the summer. Well, you go all the way into cruises next year. How do you handle that?
Well, it's actually, when you look at it on paper and you don't see the time in between that's off, it looks like an awful lot of work close together. But when you really analyze, there's a week off here, a couple weeks off there. We've had the whole month of June off, and May and June. So, when people look at it again, the first impression, looking at all these dates in a row, sounds like a lot. But if you break down the days off in between, it certainly beats digging ditches. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it does. And probably the cruises early next year give you some time to just lounge a little bit and enjoy it.
Yeah, that's kind of how they sell entertainers on. And it is really true that we have beautiful suites, outside balcony suites. So it's really, you can enjoy your cruise, but you do a couple days worth of shows, and it's a wonderful way. See, the only problem was financially is in the old days we were doing huge arenas, 10,000 seats, making $250,000 a night. Well, now it's not quite that way, but the cruises, they made you stay on the ship usually for the whole week. You may do like 2 nights or 3 nights, but you blow 2 weekends when you can be out doing one-nighters and making big bucks from large arenas. So that it doesn't go with me trying to sell you to go to a cruise because you're relaxed.
Thinking about cruises, I talked to Tom Garrett of the Classics 4, and he was telling me about the time that you had gone on stage with Dennis Yost. This was, I think, after Dennis had stopped performing with the Classics 4.
Yes, it was.
In the context of just talking to him about that, he also mentioned something about cruises, and I don't know if he's going to be on any of your cruises, but he said something about he's like a cruise host of some sort.
Oh, yes, he is. He's so glib. He's been used to being on stage in front of thousands of people. When he gets like 10 or 12 people to come out onto a ship, it's like he's like the host with the most. He's wonderful.
I got a couple people I want to mention to you, and I'll give you a hint. One is a name you already mentioned, but give me a minute on that one. First, I want to ask you if you know a guy. He was an arranger for us, and he did, I want to say, Anything Goes in Chattanooga for Harper's and a number of others. He was my most favorite arranger. Did you ever work with Perry Bodkin Jr.?
Oh, Perry Bodkin was on our first 10 albums.
Okay, there's the connection. Yes.
Oh, sure.
Because I can remember why I remember this today. I couldn't tell you, but 50 years ago, I remember a day being in the studio with Perry working on something, and he mentioned something about the fact that he had just been working with you guys.
Oh, yes. Perry was on many of our... He was such a... The thing I like about Perry is that we would... See, I do most of the vocal arrangements. Before that was Jim Pike and myself. But we would go up to Perry's house, or he'd come down. He had a beautiful house overlooking the Hollywood Hills, overlooking Hollywood, with a nice pool. So we liked to go up his house because it was nice and cool. He had some palm trees. But we'd sit out around the pool and just casually talk about arrangements for the song. And we'd sing a couple lines, the three of us, to him. And he said, that's a good idea. So he'd tape it. And so he would put into the orchestration so much more than most other guys of his ilk in the Hollywood scene, because he really cared enough. Like this particular, I would notice for you, wanting to do a pre-interview. That's a very good trait. You don't take it lightly. It's a profession. Well, Perry Bodkin was very serious. And so when he'd come to the studio with 4 tunes, in those days, I don't know if your audience knows, but the Musicians Union, you could do, or AFTRA, you could do 4 songs in 3 hours. Yeah. Take your choice. Take your pick. So you would want an arranger to come in being prepared. And he was prepared. We would have suggestions saying, hey, Perry, how about this? Well, we wouldn't do it in the studio because he'd have 2 or 3 sittings with us before the session. So we got all that out of our our system.
You mentioned the 3-hour time frame for the Musicians Union. If you went 1 minute over that, you got charged for another session. They were really strict. However, and I know you guys worked with them probably constantly, the Wrecking Crew that everybody talks about nowadays.
Oh, sure.
That was Perry's musicians as well as everyone else, and they did most of the Harper's Bazaar stuff for us. So the name of the game in Hollywood, at least, when you went into the studio to do a tune, you didn't recut it 3 or 4 or 5 times. One take, bingo, it was done. These people knew what they were doing.
That's right. Hal Blaine was a great drummer.
Hal Blaine, absolutely. And Glenn Campbell, of course, played guitar on more than a few of them.
And Lyle Ritz.
Yes, Lyle Ritz. I remember Lyle Ritz. And I was trying to remember the guy's name that actually did the arrangement for... his name was Russell Warren, I believe, or Russell something. He changed his name to Leon Russell.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. But he was listed. Somebody sent me a piece of, not sheet music, but a copy of a AFM contract from back in those days, and he was listed as the contractor on that. So a lot of people that I think both you and I have run to. I've got another name I want to throw at you, though.
Who's that?
Prior to Harper's becoming Harper's, we were called the Tikis, and we would make our trips down to Hollywood from Santa Cruz to audition ad infinitum. The auditions just went on forever, and of course we got, like everybody else, we got turned down a zillion times.
Sure.
However, we struck gold on one of the trips. We had hooked up our U-Haul trailer, stuffed it full of all of the drums and equipment and everything, went down and auditioned for a guy. And this was almost like out of the movies, in that our manager had us go into one of his side rooms. We hadn't met the guy yet. We went into the side room, and our manager said, why don't you go ahead and just start playing some tunes? Well, unbeknownst to us, the guy was right outside the door. We couldn't see him. As we finished the tune, he comes walking in, and the first thing out of his mouth, and I swear this is true, I'm going to make you guys stars.
Wow.
Who was the guy? Nick Venet.
That sounds like something Nick would do.
Yeah.
He had a great ear.
He did, and I think didn't he do some Beach Boys stuff as well?
He sure did. The last couple albums that before he died. Sure.
And I was a little surprised to hear he passed away 5 years ago.
Yeah, a little. Yeah, he did do when we saw the beach. I kind of take semi-credit for this. On Wink Martindale had a dance party on the Santa Monica Pier every Saturday, and they'd get access to appear there, come in and do their mouth to your record for nothing, and so we did this Wink Martindale show, and Nick comes over, he was our producer, he says, hey, I found these 3 guys on the beach singing like you guys.
Huh?
And I said, what? He said, oh, yeah, their father's on the way over here as their manager, but I really want to sign them. It was Nick Venet when he first met the Beach Boys. He signed them to Capitol Records.
Wow. Well, that's why we thought we just were lifted 3 inches off the ground when we heard that. He told us, go home, I'll send you a contract, and you're going to be stars. The only downside was that he never sent a contract, so we ended up going another route ultimately, finally.
He was so distracted. See, he was a new wunderkind.
Okay.
All the producers at Capitol, from the time they started the label in the early 40s, were old men by the time.
Oh, sure.
So these guys, the Good Old Boys Club, they wouldn't appreciate any new talent.
Yeah.
And Nick came to Capitol Records and said, look, you guys haven't had a hit in a couple of years now. I guarantee you, if you let me produce for you, I'll make you some hit records. That's Nick Venet.
Interesting. Have your musical taste changed since the 60s? What kind of music do you listen to now?
Well, I'm pretty highly compartmented. From the time I was a little kid, my sister was an opera singer, and my mother played piano. My dad was in minstrel shows. My brother was in a barbershop quartet. So there was all kinds of music in our house when I was, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we branched out. And I think I never compartmentalized myself to say, just listen to this. When I'm home, if I got to have a 5-hour layover somewhere, airport, I won't listen to one station. I'll walk around and hear some of the local talent that's at the lounges. I really like to come across new things and not listen to the same old thing.
I do too. But the only thing I've found is that at least the pop music of today, I'm still not into it. And I don't know if it's because I'm just stuck on the 60s. I mean, I can remember back, and I mentioned this a few times to other people, when we were coming up through the ranks, our parents used to listen to people like Lawrence Welk, and we would just kind of thumb our noses at that. Well, here, now I'm 71, and I'm having trouble getting into the music of today.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's something that it'll always be there because the kids want something of their very own. They don't want something their parents like. It's almost subliminal until they get, from the time they're like 12 or 13. But all of a sudden, they have an awakening when they're 21. Oh, now I get it, what Mom and Dad were talking about.
Let me ask you about, and you probably have more than one, all of us do, what's been your most challenging experience? And it can be either in or out of showbiz. It doesn't matter.
Oh, boy. Several. Let me just come up with one. One of the most challenging and most eye-opener was the Orange Bowl in Miami.
Huh?
Back in 1969, what's his name? The guys with the doors, Morrison?
Yes, yeah, right. Jim Morrison, yes.
Jim Morrison was so hopped up on drugs, he did a show in Miami Beach, and I think he dropped his drawers in front of 5,000 people.
Yeah.
Kids were in the audience. So they wanted to have a decency rally in Miami to offset that publicity-wise.
Yeah.
So they the only rockers would do it. Some of the hard rockers wouldn't do it because it would be real square for them to go to the society side. So there were the Lettermen, Brenda Lee, and Jimmy Dean. For people like that were on this show. And we were in the hot sun, and some of the rockers that didn't know where their amps, they blew out the electricity. We sat from like 7 o'clock in the morning until actually the rehearsal. We didn't get our rehearsal underway till about 4 in the afternoon.
Oh, jeez.
But the big offset to that was sitting out there waiting patiently all the afternoon. All of a sudden, this little guy comes walking up, not with any big entourage, walking up. How's it going? And we said, it's fine. And he said, we're having no problems, huh? Said, yes. Well, we sat there for 2 or 3 hours laughing at this guy. Well, before he got on stage to do his part, he said, do you mind if I did my set before yours? Because I've got to be in New York tomorrow. Well, the guy was Jackie Gleason.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
And he was such a delight.
Yeah.
Such a charmer.
Have you thought about writing a book, or have you already written a book?
Yeah, I've already written my book, and I think it's a pretty good title. The Lettermen have never been considered a rock and roll group. We've been considered an easy listening and romantic love ballad group. And then we sing about love ballads, so that's about the heart. But 3 or 4 years ago, there's some mountain climbers in Utah climbing the mountains, and one guy fell off and got caught between a rock and a crevice, and the other 3 people thought he was dead. They couldn't find him. So he was there for a week, alive, in this crevice. In order to get out, he had to cut his arm off.
Oh, yes, I remember that. Yeah, I remember the news story. It was big-time news.
Big-time news, and he had a big book on it, and a movie came out about it, and it was called Between a Rock and a Hard Place.
Yeah.
Remember that title?
Yes.
Well, I stole that title because if you take a couple words out, it's apropos to my group. Between Rock and a Hard Place.
Okay.
That's the title of my book.
Okay. Can I find it on Amazon? Where would I go?
In about a month or so, you will.
It's just happening now.
Oh, yes, it's taken me 3 years to write it.
Well, I've got to get a copy of it. Just talking to you, and I wish we had more time. I only got a couple more questions for you, so I don't tie you up all afternoon.
That's right.
What do you see as some of the biggest differences between the 60s and today?
Okay, there's no more difference of a generation gap between the kids who are making music and the adults of the kids who are buying the music. That always seems to be there. I guess maybe we're generalizing. Maybe there's some parents, maybe like yourself, who would get into the music of their kids and learn what attracts them to it. When I had my kids, I went to the dances with them. This is in the 70s. My kids were late 70s. So I don't think there's an answer to that. Who can know the difference? It's the nuances from age to age and not necessarily a decade to decade.
That makes sense. What's going on now? Talk about today and your plans for the future. And checking your schedule, it looks like June is the only month that you're not working.
Yeah, it's about right.
So talk a little bit about what your shows are looking like these days. And I know you have I'm going to say two new guys. They're not new. That's the wrong description. But talk to us a little bit about them and where you're working and what your shows are shaping up like.
This particular group of Lettermen, I'll go back to Bob Ingham and Jim Pike. There's a sentimental connection there. It's a great sounding group. So that was the first group, Tony Butala, Jim Pike, and Bob Ingham. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you what, Tony Butala with Bobby Poynton and Donovan T. is the best sounding Letterman and the most versatile Letterman from age group and new genre. So Donovan came in, Bob Ingham left the Letterman in 66, 67. He wanted to work for the Mormon Church, where he still was the rest of his life. And we replaced him with Jim Pike's younger brother, Gary Pike. Mm-hmm. And after Gary joined the group, we had continued having more hit records. In 1971, Jim developed a voice problem, and we auditioned people. We knew we had to keep the group going because we had several $100,000 worth of work. So sure enough, our little bass player came up and said, "Can I audition?" I said, "Well, gee whiz, Donnie, are you a singer?" He says, "Yeah, this is Jim Pike and Gary Pike's younger brother, Donnie." He was playing bass for us. So sure enough, we accepted him. He came in 72, replacing his other brother, Jim, and he stayed with us till the early 80s. So there have been 3 Pike boys in the Letterman over the years. But, Donovan T. came in 1984. He's been with the Letterman ever since. He's tall. He's a Texan. He's handsome. And he's been a Letterman for 33 years.
Wow.
Now, Dick, that's longer. Now, get this. That's longer than any other Letterman has been a Letterman beside myself.
That's really something.
Well, it was the second position in longevity. Now, Bobby Poynton came in twice. He came in 89, and then he replaced one of the guys that left. But then his wife got pregnant. He had a son. He had to get up the road within 4 years, and sure, we got someone to replace him. But sure enough, 10, 12 years later, Bobby Poynton is back in the Letterman, and he's the third longest-lasting guy in seniority in the history of the Letterman. And this combination will have been around as a combination of Letterman longer than any other combination of Letterman in the history of the group.
It's amazing. As you're saying that, you do realize that you are longer than either of those two guys. You're talking, would you say Letterman 1960, 61? What's the start date there?
Actually, the recording Letterman started in 1960.
Okay.
But before that was the Vegas stuff with Mike Barnett and Thomas Russell and Jerry Paul. That was all. We never recorded. We did an awful lot of great shows, but up to the first recording group, that was in 1960.
Okay, so 57 years for you.
Yes.
That's spectacular. And you sound great. And when I look at the schedule, I have to assume you look great because you got to take on all of this work. Looks like, where am I looking here? Andy Williams Theater in Branson. Yeah, is that something you guys do regularly?
Well, what's funny is that it's what we're going to be doing regularly. Branson is a funny thing. You have to be around for a while for these bus tour people to know who you are and who to recommend. There's 52 theaters there.
Gee whiz.
So, and thousands of buses a day. So we played, Andy Williams got ill. His brother booked us in there for just a couple of weeks while he was still ill. And then when he had to leave again, and he passed away eventually, but we did a couple of weeks, about 5, 6 years ago. And so then each year they add a few more weeks to our engagement. And now coming up on August 2nd, we opened at the Andy Williams Theater in Branson. We're there through all of, October 2nd. We're there through October, November, up through December 10th. And you have to build a following there. And we really enjoy it. The sound is fantastic. The lighting is wonderful because designed by Andy Williams, an entertainer. He knew best what an entertainer would appreciate, and their road managers and the sound men in lights and sound.
That's great. And I'm assuming some of the hottest musicians around, probably.
Well, we take our own musicians.
Oh, you do?
Sure.
Okay. That's got to cost a few bucks to take people out on the road like that.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's in the long run, it's worth the investment, because when you go, we never did from the very beginning. We always had our own guys, but we go on a stage with 4 or 5 other acts, and the headaches that these local pickup musicians would cause. They weren't, Hollywood, New York style readers, but these, I don't know why these guys didn't catch on like we did. After the first 2 weeks, we're always going to, even though we're 3 front men, we don't play ourselves while we're performing, even though I do play bass. In the first couple of years, I played bass, and Jim played guitar. But we feel that having a tight background, it's like trying to fly an airplane with lousy propellers. You have to have a good basic musicians reading, and then we have a good road manager. But then when you do your rehearsal, the shows are tighter, and we travel with them. We get to know each other, and it's like one big Letterman family.
And then do you bring in strings and horns when you need them, or do you not bring in strings and horns?
No, that there's so much, they call it now, sequencing.
Oh, yes, right.
And it's electronically, digitally sounding, and you could sound like you have 45 strings behind you with the sequencing. But we do carry our drummer, guitar, and keyboard. But all the rest of it nowadays is the horns and the harp. All that is sequenced so the people in the room hear it, but there aren't live musicians at that moment playing it.
Well, I hope I get the chance to see you guys one of these days. Obviously, if you're ever going to be doing stuff in Northern California, and I don't think I could find anything around the San Francisco area, at least not this year.
Oh, yes, with Gates, Brooks, California.
Okay.
Check it. The Letterman website, thelettermen.com.
Okay.
We got two or three nights in. They're called the Cache Creek Casino.
Yes, Cache Creek, of course, yeah.
2 nights there, and then a night at another one right up the street.
Well, I may just have to surprise you and show up to one of those shows.
Please do. Look forward and make yourself known to us.
All right, I will, and I want to thank you again for all of the information. I got to get the book. We'll be looking for it probably sometime within the next month. We can get it on Amazon, and we shall be following you guys, continuing the great trip that you've been on for so many years.
Thank you so very much, Dick. I really enjoyed our conversation. You're a true professional, and it was a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Bye.
Bye.
So bad, it makes me feel so bad. It makes me hurt so bad to see you again. Like needles and pins, people say you've been making out okay. She's in love.
Until next week, keep your face in a smile. It makes everything worthwhile. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to America's Oldies But Goodies with Dick Scapatoni. Join us again next week for more memories from the good old days. In the words of Jerry Garcia, what a long, strange trip it was. The swingin' 60s. I'm John Berg. See you then.